Hello everyone, and welcome to our In Focus BU webinar, Infant and Toddler Wellbeing, Laying the Foundations for Lifelong Mental Health. My name is Tanya, and joining me here is my colleague Janelle, and we are BU consultants with Early Childhood Australia. BU is a national initiative led by Beyond Blue in partnership with Early Childhood Australia and Headspace, and funded by the Australian Government.
Hello everybody. Our vision is that every learning community is positive, inclusive and resilient, a place where every child, young person, educator and family can achieve their best possible mental health. BU is a collaborative learning community for educators who are supporting the mental health and wellbeing of children and young people. Being part of this community means your early learning service or school has access to BU consultants to assist you in undertaking your learning and action. Is your school or service registered and participating with BU? If you aren't, register you and yourself and your school today through our website. As we begin this webinar about infant and toddler wellbeing, we're going to move to our next slide where Tanya will give an acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Tanya.
Thanks, Janelle. So we would first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from all of the lands on which we are able to gather on today. To not only acknowledge, but also pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and all those who continue to hold the memories, traditions and ways of being for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We recognise the importance of the continued connection to culture, country and community to the health, social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Throughout today's webinar, we invite you to consider how the ways that we can support infant and toddler wellbeing are informed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives. Janelle will now provide some thoughts on self-care.
So we're all here today to consider, learn and reflect about early childhood, wellbeing and education. On our screen are the BU ways for today. Remember, looking after yourself is really important. A sense of safety is the most foundational requirement for positive mental health. This means that people are safe to be who they are. People are able to work to their strengths, express their opinions and beliefs, and feel heard and respected, even when there are opposing views. During the webinar today, there'll be the opportunity for you to reflect on your own practices through polls and reflective questions. Please remember to take care of yourself as we talk about mental health today. Sometimes unexpected feelings can emerge, even difficult ones. So be aware of feelings that come up for you and make sure you talk to someone if difficulties or difficult feelings occur. So have a yarn with somebody. And now Tanya's going to give us some information about our online space today. Thanks, Tanya.
Thanks, Janelle. So before we begin, some fun technical tips for maximising all of our learning online today. For those unfamiliar with the webinar platform, welcome. This is what your screen will typically look like with the webinar viewer on the left and the control panel on the right. Throughout the webinar, you can ask questions about using the webinar function and we will have some technical support available. Our colleagues, Maria, Rita and Stephanie are working away in the background to support Janelle and I today. Thank you, team. So as you can see, the control panel with the question box is highlighted in blue. The responses in green are public responses and the ones in red are private responses. And you can use your control panel to manage your phone or audio or computer audio. So today, as mentioned, everybody is being placed in listen-only mode and your microphones have been muted as we have a large number of attendees. If you are experiencing any other difficulties at any time, please note the customer care details on the screen and contact this team directly. Throughout the webinar today, we encourage you to get involved as much as you feel comfortable. It's important that everybody feels like this is a safe space to learn and that everybody's contributions matter. You can ask questions via the questions box and we hope to respond to as many of your queries as possible during today's session. But for those that we don't get to, we'll follow up after the event concludes. Any links to resources or references we use in the content will be posted in the chat for you to copy if you wish. But they will also be available in the handout that you can download, along with some reflective questions that you might like to consider within your own learning community, perhaps with your team. These will all be available post-webinar. We also invite you to participate in the polls that we'll be launching throughout the session. And all event participants will be able to access a certificate of participation and a recording of the webinar. Over to you, Janelle, to begin our discussion today.
Thanks, Tanya. So today we're exploring the important role the early years play in laying foundations for lifelong mental health and wellbeing, and how to optimise infant and toddler mental health and wellbeing, and most importantly, what we as educators can do. As we explore these, we'll be looking at the overarching influence relationships and the environment play in positive future mental health for infants and toddlers. We hope when you leave this webinar, you and your team will reflect about the mental health of infants and toddlers in your early learning service. And now we'll move on to the next slide. Thanks, Steph. So why toddler and infant wellbeing is important. So let's explore what infant and toddler mental health means to you. Maria, could you please put our first poll up? And you can respond to as many questions as you like with this poll. And the question is, which language do you currently use when discussing the mental health of infants and toddlers? So while we give you time to answer the question.
It's an interesting question, Janelle. I think mental health often isn't considered in relation to our youngest children. We often use different terminology. But what does mental health mean to us? I think that's sort of an important reflection in this space.
And people have different beliefs and understandings of mental health, don't they, Tanya, for all sorts of reasons. So part of our job here today is to promote this awareness and understanding of mental health in toddlers and babies.
Yep, definitely. There we go. So have we got some results coming up? Wonderful. Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so not surprisingly, I think the majority of people really connected with the term social and emotional learning, which is what we have used very often in this space.
And I have to say that's a term I've used in the past as well, but I'm now saying the words mental health more intentionally as well. And
I'm also,
of course,
sorry, Janelle.
The early years learning framework also uses the social and emotional wellbeing terminology.
It does, yeah. I'm drawn to also just a small number of people indicated other. I'd be interested to hear what that terminology is. If you'd like, please feel free to share in the chat box if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, interesting results. So mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realises his or own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or to his community. Whereas when we talk about well-being relates to all aspects of a person's health, physical, emotional, spiritual, and this can change over time depending on what's happening in people's lives. So I kind of look at mental health as being part of well-being. So, but there are lots and lots of similarities, but they are different. And you can check out more about the this mental health continuum on our notice module on the BU website. So now we're going to do another poll, Maria. So while Maria puts the poll up, this one is more about mental health with toddlers and babies. So what you think is the most important aspect of mental health for toddlers and babies? Oh, there we go, it's up.
Yeah, and I think I'm really sort of connecting with all of these here, and I guess at sort of different times in different contexts, I think they would be very, very relevant. What do you think, Janelle?
Yeah, I agree. So I think all of these, I think all of these are part of infant and toddler mental health.
Mm. And definitely, it's a key I guess age to be developing um, these skills and these senses of as one of them says, sense of self, and they're all interconnected in a way. I see. There we go. So overwhelmingly, yeah, form positive and secure relationships. So the relationships are key at this age.
That's good to see, isn't it? Because that's absolutely right. The secure relationships is where a lot of what happens to us comes from, really,
Yeah.
and
All of our
babies
other
and
learning.
toddlers, and all of our other learning. But all of the other areas do play a part in infant and toddler mental health and in our own mental health.
Very much so. It's really good to see that there's all of those things are considered when people are thinking about infant toddler mental health.
So anecdotally, when asking educators to describe a mentally healthy child, they'll usually describe children in terms of their self-regulating behaviour, their emotions and thoughts, such as a child being able to express how they're feeling, able to calm themselves or play happily with other children. But I think it's important to remember that we're not actually diagnosing children. Rather, we're beginning to understand what positive and concerning mental health and mental ill health looks like, so we can support and refer more effectively to the experts. So BU does have an observation tool that may be useful to learn perspectives about children that we'll talk about a little bit more later. It's called the Beatles observation tool. So there's a growing body of Australian research about the importance of the early years that you'll find in the chat. ARACI, which is the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, research on the first 1,000 days is particularly interesting, as is the Australian Early Development Census, which is AEDC, the work that they've done, and the Australian Association for Mental Health, for Infant Mental Health, and the links will be in the chat for that as well. So the ARACI research has increased our understanding of the environment and biological factors that shape babies and toddlers' development, and shows us how much these early years influence future outcomes for development, health, wellbeing, and for learning. The AEDC census also provides insight into all domains of development. Again, you'll find links in the chat to read more about this. So what a child experiences in their very early years lay the foundations for lifelong mental health and wellbeing. The first 3 years of a child's life are critical to development, and research has shown early experiences within infants nurturing relationships plays a crucial role in the development of their social and emotional health and wellbeing. So now let's find out a little bit more about brain development. So Tanya is going to be looking at that. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, Janelle. As we've defined, mental health in babies and toddlers is the optimal social, emotional, and cognitive well-being of children aged from birth to 3 years. It depends on the quality of a child's environment and their relationships, family, and educators. And these have a significant impact on brain development, with the foundations for future brain functioning being embedded in the brain structure at this stage. As we can see on the slide, the Centre on the Developing Child at Harvard University talks about how building a strong foundation in the early years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental health and better overall health. Brains are built over time from the bottom up. The basic architecture or structure of the brain is built through an ongoing process that starts before birth and continues throughout our life. It provides a foundation for social and emotional development. Brains also build from the most simple to the most complex. The simple part keeps us alive, breathing and temperature control and other things like that. And the complex area is where we think and make decisions. And emotions are processed in the middle. The kind of experience determines the kind of hormone that is released. Positive experiences release hormones that promote brain growth, and negative experiences can release stress hormones that inhibit growth. The emotional area plays a pivotal role in that all experiences are attached to an emotion, and the emotional area in the brain is connected in some ways to all other areas. The more repetitions of experience types, the greater the intensity, and the earlier these occur in a child's life, the stronger the connections are. So we've learned the way the connections between brain cells develop in the first few years of life are affected by the quality of the child's early relationships and their environment. Brain development depends on how a baby or toddler is feeling during events. The more safe and secure a baby feels, the more likely healthy connections will be made in their brain. When adults build secure relationships within a supportive environment, they are promoting children's mental health and well-being now and for the future. A major part of this developmental process is the interaction between children and their parents or significant others in the family or community. Without responsive interactions and caring, or if responses are unreliable or inappropriate, then a brain's architecture will not form as expected, which can lead to issues with well-being, development, learning and behaviour. We learn from babies as much as they learn from us. We just need to know what to look for. A common term is serve and return, and it's very much like a dance. Also may be referred to as cueing and responding. Research shows how important it is for educators to recognise these encounters as reciprocal, and for educators to see the infant as an active participant. They're not a passive receiver of care. To recognise the infant's agency by allowing the infant to develop a strong sense of self and well-being. When adults respond appropriately, neural connections which promote social and emotional learning are then strengthened. And these interactions, when repeated frequently in the early years, positively shape brain architecture and form strong foundations for the future. However, if a child is exposed to abuse, neglect, poverty or trauma and receives unreliable nurturing, then the developing structures in the brain do not form as expected and will certainly be fragile. These adverse experiences are sometimes described as toxic stress and may be detrimental for social and emotional development and for future well-being. I will leave you with this question now to take away and discuss with your team. In your daily interactions with children, how do you help to influence their brain architecture and social and emotional skills to develop in a positive way? Over to you, Janelle, to discuss attachments and relationships.
Thanks, Tanya. So we know mental health and well-being is influenced by the quality of a child's early relationships, and early attachment experiences lay the foundation for mental health and well-being throughout childhood and into adulthood. And this is partly because the quality of early relationships influences the development of the child's brain and their nervous system and the level of stress-related hormones in the body. But before we look at attachment, let's define what we mean in this context. So if we talk about primary caregivers, that is a caregiver, usually but not always a family member or parent to the child. So it's a caregiver usually from the child's family. A key educator is the educator who holds a particular child in mind and heart, not necessarily physically being with the child at all times, but that they hold the child in mind. This allows continuity of care and communication with families, as well as the special connection with that child. So let's look at what attachment theory tells us. So everyone has developed a certain pattern of attachment. The pattern of attachment a child develops has a direct impact on the architecture of their brain and is a blueprint for all future relationships. Research in attachment theory has direct implications for the work we do with groups of children in early learning services. So what is attachment? Attachment is a deep and enduring, they're key terms, deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. So infants and toddlers, you can see on the slide, infants and toddlers rely on adults to meet their physical and emotional needs. To survive, infants instinctively develop attachment relationships with key adults in their life. And children also have important secondary attachments with other key people, other family members and educators. And the quality of these attachment experiences is also important for future relationships. But the child has to form an attachment with one person first before they can move on to secondary attachments. And the pattern that's established between the primary caregiver and the child is the blueprint the child uses with other people in their life. So why is it important? The Early Years Learning Framework in Outcome 1 tells us warm, responsive and trusting relationships help children feel safe and secure to explore their world. And this secure attachment, deep and enduring emotional bond provides that home base from which a child begins to explore their new environment. As children grow and change, these attachment relationships do remain significant. However, attachment patterns can change with other significant relationships later in life. It doesn't mean that educators will never be a child's primary attachment figure, but they can help a child experience a different relationship pattern. Attachment patterns influence a person's interactions, personality, cognitive ability, values, morals, and beliefs, and their sense of identity. And research also tells us that in a population, about 60% are seen to be securely attached. That's their attachment pattern, being securely attached. And insecurely attached people usually amount to about 40% of the population. But there's a whole range of types of patterns even within those insecurely attached people, and some people see that as different personality types. So it's 40% of the population. So the next slide talks about relations and self-regulation. Thanks, Steph. So we know that principle 1 is secure, respectful and reciprocal relationships. And this is number 1 for a reason. Relationships between infant and caregiver must be sensitive and responsive. Relationships are central to the self-regulation process, and secure attachment is the most effective type of attachment relationship for promoting mental health and well-being. So what's self-regulation? Self-regulation is the ability to manage emotions and behaviour or reactions, and it's a process that depends on learning and maturation. A child's ability to develop the skills needed for self-regulation is influenced by internal factors such as their age, their temperament and experience, and external factors like the environment and interaction with others. Learning self-regulation begins in the womb and progresses from external to internal self-regulation, with gradually decreasing support necessary from adults and the environment. Infants develop the ability to regulate first with another or co-regulate within a responsive caregiving relationship. As people grow, they generally need less co-regulation as they develop the skills and the capacity to do it themselves. However, most people never totally self-regulate. There are always times where they'll need to co-regulate. The greater a sense of well-being, the more likely someone is able to regulate. So using a circle of security language, you as educators act as the child's secure base and safe haven in your place of work with children. And this means children will move out from you to explore their world while you watch over them. You share their delight, you help them, and you enjoy them. And what they are doing, knowing they can return to you when they need comfort, protection, help organising their feelings, and again to share their delight. A secure, safe base is always bigger, stronger, wiser and kind, follows the lead of children and takes charge when needed. When children are able to use this circle effectively, they generally have a positive sense of well-being and experience positive mental health and responsive regulation. Some children and caregivers have strengths while exploring their world, that's their strength, and others have strengths while protecting or comforting, and this can distort their ability to regulate. The younger a child, the closer they are to their hands. When holding a baby, for example, gazing into their eyes, the baby will self-regulate by looking away or exploring their world, and then looking back and cooing. Toddlers will spend more and more time exploring, but still return to fill up that emotional cup regularly, even if they just look back to check that you're still there. While self-regulation is an important goal, it's not the end goal, and we all need to be able to self-regulate and co-regulate. So your influence in terms of regulation: children learn self-control and appropriate emotional expression and behaviour by watching and experiencing how other people manage their emotions and form their own experiences of how others behave. And you can help contain children's stressful experiences, such as when they feel overwhelmed, unsure or frightened, by showing them how to become calm to get their needs met. This might include sitting with the child, using soothing language, helping them take a few deep breaths, and providing reassurance that they're safe. So usually using the circle of security language, this is when the child returns or is close to the hands, when the caregiver can help organise the child's feelings. So we've got a couple of examples of what this can look like, and from a colleague of mine, she shared this story with me, and she remembers working with a toddler who found regulating her anger really tricky. The child got angry really quickly and stayed angry for a really long time. And it was really hard for her to process the moment and move on. She couldn't do it by herself. As her key educator, my colleague worked together with this child to have big, strong hugs every time she got angry, and this took a long time to establish. At first, the last thing she wanted was a hug, and sometimes the last thing my colleague felt like doing was giving her a hug, but they persisted. Big, strong hugs where they wrapped their arms around each other and slowed breathing down, breathing loud and slow, and using a strong rhythmic pat on her back. And neither spoke in these big, strong hugs. One day, the little girl ran to my colleague and asked for a big, strong hug, and my colleague hadn't noticed anything that had indicated that she was angry. And this time she really didn't seem angry, and she wasn't. She thought she might be getting angry. So she sought out my colleague for that big, strong hug independently before she got angry. So she was starting to read those internal signs. So I think that's a really nice example of what co-regulation can look like, and then self-regulation. And Tanya has an example too.
It really is. It was a beautiful story. Thanks for sharing that, Janelle. I often think about when I was often in infant and toddler rooms and watching when the educators actually stopped being busy and they just stayed still and they sat down in their environment, and I watched as the infants and toddlers became calmer. I could actually see it happen in front of me. They didn't need to stay close or cling to their educator all of the time anymore. They went out and explored the space and just looked back at them occasionally to connect in, because they knew their educator would be there. This is essentially the picture of the circle of security, which you were mentioning before. I think it's a great example of how it shows that we all need to co-regulate before we can self-regulate. So now let's move on to look at socio-ecological influences for infants and toddlers. Thanks, Steph. So experiences in the early childhood years can affect the way people respond and react to the world they live in for the rest of their lives. So a positive start is crucial. We've talked about relationships and the environment as being one of the greatest influences on infant and toddler current and future wellbeing. Connections between brain cells developing in the first few years of life are affected by the quality of the child's early relationships and their environment. A quote that I love and I think speaks to infants' developing sense of identity is from D.W. Winnicott. He was a paediatrician in the UK, and a lot of the founding work around attachment relationships is accredited to Winnicott. And he often said, there is no such thing as a baby, there is a baby in someone. And for me, this quote highlights an infant's formation of a sense of identity through close connection with a significant attachment figure. As they grow, their sense of self will develop independent of others, and co-regulation, which Janelle just discussed, is a very important aspect of this process. Co-regulation before self-regulation. So what does it look like for infants and toddlers? Feeling a sense of belonging and building connections with others is a protective factor for mental health. From the time they're born, infants rely on the adults around them to meet their physical and emotional needs. As we've mentioned, families are the first and most important influences on children's social and emotional development. They do this by responding effectively to infants and toddlers, providing examples of how they manage their own feelings, and talking with children about feelings and how to manage them. And as we all know, educators can provide very similar support, and you do during your everyday work with infants and toddlers. So there are many other influences in the social environment. And if we look at the diagram on the screen, which is Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model, so the people and settings most closely involved with the child, family, community, and learning settings are shown at the centre of the diagram. Through their relationships with others and growing awareness of social values and expectations, children build a sense of where they fit in the social world. Developing an understanding about self and others is integral to social emotional learning. Then outside of the immediate family, learning communities have the most significant developmental influence. Active participation in positive learning environments influence the ability of infants to understand and cope with the world around them. It's critical that a mentally healthy learning community models respectful interactions, promotes inclusion, and values diversity. Having a strong cultural identity enhances self-concept and promotes a sense of connectedness and belonging. And children's identity is nurtured when they learn about their cultural traditions and when they're respected for their cultural values. Through positive interactions, babies and toddlers learn to feel good about themselves and enjoy interacting with others. They learn how to manage a range of feelings and to communicate effectively to get their needs met. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So we're moving on now and thinking about how we can optimise infant and toddler mental health. To do that, we can assist infants and toddlers to develop a positive sense of self and identity. We can look at relationships and the environment through a risk and protective factor lens. And we can apply this factor model to our practice focuses on our relationships that are caring and responsive to children, promote inclusion and connectedness, and establish family partnerships. How might we do this? Well, one way is what Janelle referred to as before, the BU Beatles observation tool. We can use this observation tool to notice and record behaviour, emotions, thoughts, learning, and social aspects of the environment. And then we can start to intentionally plan. We can provide a supportive learning environment conducive to the development of positive mental health and wellbeing. In this, we need to look at our everyday practices that increase protective factors and that will decrease the impact of risk factors in our relationships and our environments. We can assist infants and toddlers attending early learning services to develop a positive sense of self and identity through the promotion of inclusive practices. And we can establish family partnerships to promote a sense of identity and belonging. So let's look at how we work with infants and toddlers. Often, work with infants and toddlers is considered care only. But what takes precedence, care or curriculum? So it's time to bring up the next poll. Maria, if you can set that up, please. Beautiful, thank you. So care and curriculum are inherently related. In everyday practice, how often do you find that care and curriculum are interconnected? Janelle, what are your thoughts on this?
I think they're absolutely inherently connected, but I do think I think they absolutely go together, but you have to have the care before the
Yeah,
curriculum can take off, because
yeah,
children need to feel secure and safe before they can learn.
yeah. It is a very crucial aspect of our practice. There's research commenting that care may be being devalued in our society, and curriculum is the more valued, the education side. And this can create a disconnect between what knowledge we value as educators to build our professional identity and the care skills that infants require to meet their needs. So how do we recognise and value care more in this space? Beautiful.
And
So
I
we've got the results. And just like you mentioned, Janelle, always, that was very much the popular response.
yeah, yeah.
It's very much always in the practice.
And I think the younger the child, the more likely the always.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Right, so we'll move on a bit more and go back to the risk and protective factors. So the diagram on the screen lists a range of different risk and protective factors that might be present in a child's and an infant and toddler's life. And the more protective factors that are in a child's life, the more resilient they are. And it's important to recognise too that risk factors can occur at an individual, family or community level. So when adults help to reduce risk factors and enhance protective factors, children are better able to build positive relationships with those around them. So back to you now, Janelle.
Thanks, Tanya. So there's a nice quote on the screen that comes from Jack Shonkoff, who's the director of the Harvard Center. And what he says, this is a really powerful statement for everyone involved with young children. So positive relationships are the foundation of children's mental health and wellbeing. It's also generally agreed and supported by research that relationships are at the heart of quality early childhood education and care. That environment of relationships is crucial for the development of a child's brain architecture. So in the first years of life, children rapidly develop the social and emotional capabilities that prepare them to be self-confident, trusting, empathetic, intellectually inquisitive, communicative, and enable them to relate well to others. So some great examples of positive relationships between adults and children show adults responding to children in a timely manner, showing what they know and are accepting of the child as an individual and are available for that child. So using the circle of security language, we also see these as examples of relationships involving adults who are bigger, stronger, wiser and kind. So when talking to a colleague recently about a child who was struggling, we talked about strengthening the educator hands. So being even more consistently bigger, stronger, wiser and kind. And stronger hands mean added security and safety for the child to be able to move in and out from. And I know Tanya has an example of bigger, stronger, wiser and kind on scales, Tanya. So if the kind is missing.
Yeah, I've often seen the diagram around the circle of security talking about bigger, stronger and wiser being at one end of the seesaw and kind at the other. And we need to make sure that seesaw is very balanced, because if it sort of tips too much in one favour, we maybe come across as sort of weak in our support for a child. But if we're not kind enough, then we come across as mean. So it's very important that we try and sort of keep that balance, and reflective practice is very helpful for that as well.
So educators can actively build those positive relationships by being really conscious and using both their verbal and non-verbal signals, especially for infants, and reading the verbal and non-verbal signals of infants, and being responsive and in tune with what's happening for children, and giving children time to explore, but then to take comfort and seek comfort when they need it. And communicating with families, I think, is critical with young children, with babies and toddlers. So
Yeah,
they're keys. Yeah.
I often think too, I often talk a lot about rituals for babies and toddlers as opposed to routines. I guess an example of a ritual I often remember witnessing was an educator sitting with her group of toddlers on the mat before lunchtime. And one by one, she was calling their name and they came over to her and she washed their hands with a warm washcloth while she sung to them. And then they walked away to the lunch table. This was not hurried in any way and it was just beautiful to witness. It was also amazing to see the group of toddlers watching her so intently and waiting for their turn, as they knew when their name was said, they would get this incredible, calm, intimate moment with their educator and fill their emotional bucket. A ritual is carried out with love and care and creates a connection and warm memory. And we can all think of rituals we were a part of growing up, or even now perhaps. Whereas in contrast, routines are often carried out quickly in large groups and provide no space for emotional connection.
And educators cannot replace a primary caregiver, but they have the opportunities for that child to experience a different relationship with another. And I heard Jude Cassidy, who's another attachment guru, who talks about a boat being attached to a jetty and to aligning this with a relationship. So you imagine the jetty is the hands and or the caregiver, and the boat is the child. And you know jetties are designed to have some flexibility, and the boat is sometimes joined to that jetty and sometimes goes out to do what it has to do, only to return to the jetty. And when it's at the jetty, it's sometimes really close and sometimes a little way away, and they kind of bounce around accordingly. And they have a little dance really, and then move in and out as they need to, just as people in relationships do.
Thanks, Janelle. The key educator approach, which you mentioned earlier, is a great example of responsive practice, which nurtures these relationships and builds the protective factors for mental health. It also supports connection and partnership with families and has been shown to be beneficial for educator wellbeing due to increased work satisfaction from deeper relationships between infants and educators. I think you found the Dan Siegel quote that I love about relationships are not the icing on the cake, they are the cake.
I love it. That's one of my favourite quotes. Yeah.
Thanks, Janelle. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So we'll begin to look at environments here. And from our knowledge of brain development architecture, we know that information about our environment travels through the nervous system to the brain, which interprets input as sight, sound, touch, etc. And the environments where children grow up and learn influence their development, mental health and wellbeing, and outcomes for later life. So a quote from Anne Stonehouse talks about infants and toddlers. They, meaning educators, set up rich environments that invite exploration and experimentation. Educators take advantage of learning opportunities in ordinary, everyday experiences, including routines. Their conversations and interactions with children are authentic and genuine. Their cues are subtler. They are more vulnerable. You have to be cleverer about building learning into daily routines and rituals. Strong family educator partnerships are more critical, and culturally based child rearing practices are more prominent. I used to talk a lot also about being in the bubble with infants during caregiving moments, such as nappy changing, feeding, dressing, going to sleep. This refers to being completely present in the moment with the child, being in tune and giving 100% of your attention. Many educators shared with me after our conversation that this was a light bulb moment for their practice in realising the emotional impact on a young child being treated as a task to complete. In contrast, educators also shared in feedback over the next few months with how connected and enjoyable care moments had now become for both the child and educator when they gave their full attention and engaged fully. So supportive environments are where children are given responsive care to be able to explore independently, yet are comfortable coming back for comfort and security if needed. They are places where children feel safe to be themselves.
So, as I've mentioned previously, knowing how the circle of security works really does assist with that sense of well-being and positive mental health for everybody, including children. And we know supportive environments include adults responding to infants and toddlers consistently and sensitively so they feel safe and secure and are consistent and predictable, and environments that are really inclusive support infants and toddlers' mental health, and reflecting on the family context and the broader community are all really key factors. But why is the environment important? Because it can foster that sense of belonging and connectedness, and it helps children develop that really strong sense of identity and promotes feelings of safety and security and that sense of belonging and connectedness. And social emotional learning is enhanced through a balanced, planned and holistic approach that embraces a range of learning experiences and environments.
Thanks, Janelle. And I also want to mention that you can't discuss an environment for infants and toddlers without discussing the adults who are in it, who create it and maintain it. Infants do best when their caregivers encourage them and provide safe opportunities to explore, play and learn. Joy, laughter and having fun are important to their learning. Infants and young children are affected by stressful events, even those they don't understand. They are very sensitive to how their parents and caregivers react to stress. Stressed infants and young children may develop emotional problems, behaviour issues, developmental delays, or physical health effects that can last for a long time. So to sum up, a supportive, inclusive environment with children responding to infants and toddlers consistently and sensitively will support the development of secure attachment and lead to quality relationships. This will support their social and emotional learning, enabling the development of self-regulation and a positive sense of self. We're coming up to the last 10 minutes, and I'll just pass over to Janelle now to talk more specifically about family partnerships in our environment. Thanks, Janelle.
Thanks. It's probably one of the most critical areas of our work with babies and toddlers. So I'll try and I'm acknowledging that, but I want to make it as important as it should be. So we have an understanding that working in partnership with families and other professionals is that really, really important part of children's development. And partnerships involve trust, communication, really respecting diversity and including families in collaborative decision making. And you can also go to our website, the family partnership area, to find out more about this. But I'll just read Anne Stonehouse's comment, who says, providing good quality programs for the under threes, strong family educator partnerships are more critical. Culturally based child rearing practices are more prominent, and open communication supports understanding. And we know there's currently a lot of discussion around increased stresses in the home environment for young children, things like electronic devices, how busy adults are, how children are surrounded by a lot of stressed people. So if we think of that in terms of considering it a risk factor, and the way to work with that is to increase protective factors and increase work on things that we do have more control over, like being inclusive, like keeping communication open, like being aware of the impact of family situations on children, and helping identify potential external sources of support where appropriate. So I think we can move on to the next slide, Steph, where we're talking about professional practice. So the early years learning framework offers pedagogical guidelines like using the holistic approach and being responsive to children, planning and implementing learning through play and balancing this with intentional teaching, and creating physical social learning environments that have a positive impact on children while valuing their cultural and social context of children and their family. While also assessing and monitoring children's learning, it's really important to keep a track on children's learning. So Anne Stonehouse says, in really good programs, educators are intentional in their practice. They tune into children. They try really hard to understand what they are attempting to communicate, and they always try to respond sensibly, respectfully, and with warmth. They know a good quality program for babies and toddlers is not simply a matter of watering down elements of a curriculum for over threes. And I think that's something we all need to remember. We do have another poll, Maria. So I think this is our last poll.
We're just going to skip that one, Janelle, just for time's sake.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. And
I think it's just important to reflect before we go to the next slide about the question, which was how often do we see ourselves supporting the mental health of infants and toddlers in our professional practice? All of the time, often, sometimes, or not as much as we would like? Just maybe you would like to all reflect on that individually as we go, I think, almost to the next slide, I think,
that's
Steph.
probably.
Sorry, just catching up here.
Yeah. So
Beautiful.
I think that you were going to talk to that slide, Tanya, I think.
Beautiful. So I think we want to talk a bit more about environments as it's on the slide. Infants and toddlers benefit from having plenty of opportunities to develop and learn and practice their social and emotional skills within their environments with educators and other children as well. So we talk about planning environments, and this doesn't just refer to the physical space, but also the temporal space. And that means how fast or slow things may happen, when they happen, and how they happen in the environment. An example of this I heard from an educator was in realising their babies spend a large part of their day on the floor and were hearing and feeling fast-moving feet and the click and clunk of shoes, and thinking about how this may be causing their babies some unsettledness and stress. This reflection changed their environment. They took off their shoes when entering the room and they consciously slowed down. No more fast feet. So there's a lot of incidental learning opportunities that happen through the day and that educators can take advantage of as well. We can be encouraging a child to express what they're feeling in the moment as they experience positive or difficult feelings. We might label an emotion with an infant so they can make their connections and develop the ability to recognise and name emotions as they grow. We may notice and acknowledge when a child uses a social emotional skill, such as empathy. And in building relationships, we can be getting to know children by observing their interests and behaviour and by sharing information with families and carers, being an interested and skilled observer during children's play. Be on the lookout for different cues, both non-verbal and verbal, from infants and toddlers. Be using effective listening skills, showing warmth and interest in children's feelings and experiences, especially during the care moments, like feeding and toileting, as well as during play and other learning experiences. Creating different opportunities for children to explore and play and learn. And as the Circle of Security teaches us, encouraging exploration while being there to provide assistance if needed. So we might move on to the next slide, please, Stephanie. So we'll just focus a bit on play here. The Early Years Learning Framework has a specific emphasis on play-based learning and the principles and practices that determine our pedagogy. It defines play-based learning as a context for learning through which children organise and make sense of their social worlds as they engage actively with people, objects and representations. Engaging and responsive environments and play are crucial to the developing brain architecture and social and emotional development in children. When we say that play is a vehicle for children's learning and development, how do we consider infants and toddlers in this space? So we all know that play is important for physical development, but it's just as important for their mental development. It provides children with opportunities to practice and make sense of what they have seen around them and learn new ways to be thinking and doing things. Play can stimulate various parts of the brain, strengthening brain development. And it activates memory, language, sensory motor skills, self-regulation, planning and organisation, learning and attention. Even as infants and toddler educators, we have a responsibility to plan for play. It is not a haphazard occurrence where we might put material and equipment out and stand back to watch what happens or might not happen. We plan and implement learning through play. We intentionally teach. We develop an understanding of what children know and how they can further support their learning and development. We do this by observing children and documenting and monitoring their learning. Infants love playing with adults in joyful interactions. Families take an active role and babies play. For example, with touch and in simple rhymes, in building partnerships with parents. We make the most of the moments at the beginning and end of each day to model and encourage play and parent participation in play-based experiences. Play can involve movement, for example, holding the baby while singing, swaying, or gently dancing. Play can involve simple rhymes, animal noises, books, blowing raspberries, and playing peekaboo. For infants and toddlers, music is especially important. Using our own voices when we sing, building connections. We use eye contact and facial expressions in finger plays. Our own voices are so powerful when we sing instead of using auditory stimulus such as CDs. It's all about connections between educators and children. With toddlers, they may start to take an interest in other children and often like to play near another child. They may not interact with the other child much, but they play side by side. Play with older children often involves the older child making the toddler laugh without expecting the toddler to share or cooperate. Janelle, over to you just to finish up.
Thanks, Tanya. So this slide is our always be you symbol called our connect symbol, and I just want you to have a think about how this relates to you, between you with infants and toddlers, and between you and your infants and toddlers. Just have a think about how that works for you, and that is our always be you symbol. Next slide, Steph. So it's almost time to finish our webinar. So just have a think about what you will take away from this webinar for further discussion with your teams. You have access to lots of links and quite a few reflective questions as well that are posted in the chat, and they're available as that downloadable handout. And
what will be your takeaway, Janelle?
My take, good question, Tanya. So my takeaway, I think, is how closely immersed babies and toddlers and families are with educators when babies and toddlers are babies and toddlers. Like we're all in it together, rather than us and them. It has to be together. What about yours, Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, I guess being a part of this webinar has really made me think about using the term mental health. It's something that traditionally I haven't done. I've more used social emotional learning, but when are the appropriate times that we can think more about the mental health of infants and toddlers, and how will that support their mental health as adults if we're focused on their mental health at this age?
Good reflection. So we might move on to
questions coming through the chat box as well.
We might move on to the final slide now. Thanks, Steph. So Tanya, I think you were starting with this one.
Yes, I was just on a roll. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating today. It's so wonderful to see so many of you online with us and to really promote the importance of infant and toddler wellbeing within your learning communities. So when you exit, you'll be prompted to complete the exit survey, and please remember to complete this, and please include the names of anyone watching with you. We really appreciate that feedback.
And as many of you know, these webinars are a great way not only to learn, reflect and put learning into action, they also assist in demonstrating our individual commitment to continued professional development with BU. But have you heard they can also support documentation and guide whole of service or school professional learning and continuous improvement. So contact our team today and we can assist you with this. For anyone already with a participating service or school, simply contact your BU consultant. like Tanya or myself. If your service or school isn't a registered participating service, if you'd like to know more about what's involved, check out how to start the experience and join today, and see the link in the chat to getting started. Also join in a check-in event and talk about what you've learned and done soon. Often consultants spot great learning and action that's being done without educators even noticing, and it's often easier for a pair of outside eyes and ears to notice. So thanks again everybody for coming today and for listening and for contributing through chat, and we hope you can take some really valuable learning and actions away from today. Thank you. Bye-bye.